Welcome to episode 141 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic, and I want to talk about T-Mobile and fiber. So T-Mobile did conduct a pilot in New York City and way back in 2021, trialing a fiber service, and now they have rolled it out in 2 places in Colorado, Pueblo, which is very close to where I own a little bit of property in southern Colorado, as well as North Glen. And New York is their 3rd market for their fiber service. And pricing for 500 megabit appears to be $55 a month, so it's very closely priced to its 5G FWA service. They are offering one gigabyte, but there's no pricing available on that. So, it's got me thinking, in the past, when I've spoken with T-Mobile, they've always sort of referred to fiber as a commodity. That's because clearly they weren't investing in it like AT&T is. But, this could have further reaching effects with respect to its mobile 5G deployment. You need fiber for critical backhaul. And one of the challenges as T-Mobile does grow its fixed wireless access service is it will need access to backhaul. So I've kind of dug into this a little bit further. Obviously, T-Mobile is not building out a fiber network on its own. It's likely partnering with companies that own fiber assets, dark fiber assets, those sorts of things. But this is interesting, and I think it potentially, not only can they monetize this, have it as a supplemental offering to its 5G FWA service, which I am using in Bastrop, but it could also serve as backhaul. And I'm wondering, I'm sure you probably caught this news, and if you did, what are your insights?
Now that I'm no longer strobing or strobing very lightly, I actually looked into this a little bit because I heard about this announcement as well, and I was kind of curious.
Yeah.
And it seems as though they actually are partnering with 2 companies. They've actually announced who they're partnering with less than 24 hours ago, so this is still fairly fresh news.
Yeah.
They said that they're partnering with Pilot Fiber in New York and Intrepid Fiber in Colorado.
Yeah.
So clearly they're not the ones actually building out the infrastructure.
Right.
But they are essentially reselling this fiber service, taking it wholesale and reselling it as a T-Mobile branded product. And the name recognition can actually help quite a bit.
Yeah.
I currently live in a place where I can choose between AT&T fiber and Google Fiber, even though I believe it's the exact same infrastructure. So it's very interesting. I don't think that this approach will necessarily supplement the T-Mobile 5G network in the way that AT&T's fiber is.
Yeah.
But I do think that it will give T-Mobile more options to sell different types of services to customers. Because realistically, in these areas where fiber is available, I think T-Mobile would much rather customers use fiber than fixed wireless. So
Yeah.
I think that's really what it is I think they want to have as much access to as many types of connectivity as possible and make the best option available to that customer.
Yeah, no, it's, I think you're spot on. Certainly from a capacity standpoint, New York makes sense. Now, Pueblo, in this other town in southern Colorado, it's not a major metropolitan area, but yeah, I think your insights are sound. I mean, this does release some pressure and congestion off of its licensed spectrum that it's deploying within FWA. But it'll be interesting to see how this sort of all rolls out. But if they're successful with it, and I agree, if it's T-Mobile branded versus these more regional broadband service providers, it could really lift what they're doing in sort of a like you said, like a wholesale or a private label scenario. But it's interesting, and we'll continue to monitor that. And as updates come, we'll share those on future podcasts. But let's move to your first topic. And I did catch this news this week. So you want to talk about AT&T and Verizon And they voluntarily have agreed to, the deployment, from a full power perspective with C-band. And you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so it's actually AT&T, Verizon, US Cellular, and T-Mobile, because they're all essentially using this spectrum. And they sent a letter to the FCC saying that they agreed to the voluntary commitments related to air traffic safety and the deployment of the C-band spectrum. So they'll be following all the rules that are necessary, but they will be actually committing to full power transmission, no longer half power.
Yeah.
Which will actually probably help me in San Diego because we have an airport downtown, and I live downtown, so I'll probably get better signal on mid-band now. And ultimately, this is one of those things where the altimeters are actually the biggest impedance here. Not to make a joke about resistance and radio signals, but I think that ultimately this was an issue for old aircraft and really wasn't an issue for new aircraft. And the airlines really didn't want to deal with it. And it seems like, there's 188 airports where these efforts are in effect.
Yeah.
And I think that, this will probably end up being just another bump on the road for 5G, but I think it will be important for the availability of 5G services and the network build out, because it's 188 airports. That's a lot of land. And and it's not just the airport. It's like, I think it's 5 miles around the airport, something like that. So
It is, yeah.
there's a lot of low income areas that are underserved around these airports because, metropolitan areas like to build airports where the land is cheap, which tends to be poorer neighborhoods.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is something that actually happened on Friday, after we published our last podcast. But the news slowly trickled out, and now everybody's aware of it. But it's a really big development because I think it kind of finally puts to rest the whole C-band aviation interference issue with altimeters, and I hope that we can just move on and start focusing on standalone and enabling cool and interesting applications of 5G with aviation, which I will be talking about later.
You will, yeah, and there are some really cool applications for airport deployments there. Hopefully we can quit whipping this horse to death. This is probably the 8th or 10th time that we've talked about it on the podcast, but it's good news. And I mean, and certainly C-band for Verizon is very strategic because they had very little mid-band assets prior to spending the 40-something billion that they did on it. And so they need to get that deployed, with full power sooner versus later, to your point, to provide better coverage and performance. So
just one correction.
Yeah.
They spent 52.9 billion with incentive payments, clearing costs, and spectrum licenses.
Wow, I didn't catch that. So even a bigger price tag. So yeah, it behooves them to get those assets deployed ASAP. Let's move to my second topic this week. And our friends at 5G Americas, Chris Pearson and Viet, they've published some numbers around 5G. And the headline here is that, based on where we're at today and where things are headed, that they're predicting that by 2027 we could hit nearly 6 billion 5G subscribers. And so, the question that always comes to my mind, and we've talked about subscribers and POPs and that sort of thing in the past, is, are things on track? So just a little to kind of delve into the numbers a little bit deeper. North America had a total of about 120 million 5G connections at the end of 2022. Our friend Chris at 5G Americas, basically from his perspective, he feels like, things are definitely on track. In an article, I believe this was light reading, and it's data that comes from Omdia. They're indicating that 455 million global 5G connections were added in 2022. Overall, those figures represent a 14% sequential quarterly growth from 922 million in Q3 of last year to over a billion in Q4 of 2022. So by all measures, things seem to be on track. we've talked about this. I mean, you need the device support. That's happening at all the different frequency bands. But what's your take?
I have thought about this a little bit, and I'm not sure whether I agree with this number or not,
Okay.
mostly because I do feel like if we were just talking smartphones, I think 6 billion is wrong. Um, but if we're talking other 5G services
Or
outside the
sensors,
smartphone,
or sensors, and that's my assumption. Yeah.
yeah, because it says 5G subscribers.
Right.
So I guess it depends what you define to be the subscription, because I
Yeah.
think there's going to be a lot of 5G services out there that aren't a subscription, but are actually like a service where you bundle connectivity with analytics and a bunch of other stuff and hardware. So it gets a little murky, but I think maybe if we're talking 5G connections, yeah, 6 billion by 2027, I think that's possible. But
Okay.
5G subscribers as smartphone users, I'm not sure about that one. So
That's interesting that you bring that up, because yeah, I mean, so within the enterprise, if you're looking at, a solution that includes IoT, a subscriber could represent multiple connections,
can a
right?
robot be a subscriber?
Yeah, who knows? But yeah, that's interesting. So, and honestly, I didn't dig super deeply into the report. That might be some homework to kind of surface the issue that you're bringing up there. But anyway, with that said, let's talk about your 5G airplane use case, right? It's Lockheed Martin.
Yeah, so this is kind of a continuation of something we've been talking about with Lockheed Martin. They've been talking about their 5G.mil ecosystem, which is kind of like their platform for how they're going to enable the Department of Defense to leverage, next generation connectivity to enable, 21st century military applications.
Mhm.
Um, and this 5G.mil was demonstrated as the core platform for a um, network-enabled network enabled analytics for readiness 5G initiative called NEAR, which the Department of Defense loves making those acronyms.
Man, that's a
Um,
mouthful, isn't
and
it?
they basically took portable devices to provide complete flight data recordings and AI-driven predictive maintenance and sensor data analytics
Yeah.
following the landing of an aircraft. And by doing so, Lockheed said that they were able to make faster decision making, and be able to maintain and get the right experts in place to fix issues and ahead of time, and basically anticipate what might need to be replaced on the plane
Yeah.
before it needs replacing.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just one of those things where so much of keeping a plane in the air is about the logistics of maintaining it. And whenever we were talking about, like, the war in Ukraine and how Russia was struggling to keep its planes in the air, one of the biggest reasons was just a lack of parts.
Yeah.
So um, you know, maintenance is a key component to operational readiness. And if 5G is going to enable that, um, it's a really interesting application. And the thing is that uh, Lockheed Martin has already worked with operators like AT&T for 5G high-speed data transfers. I think we talked about that one in the podcast.
Yeah.
But um, this near system kind of builds off of that earlier work, and kind of helps pull that data and do quicker analysis of the airplane sensor data. And it's really cool to see this kind of slowly progressing. And I think this application is really reasonable. There's so much data that
Yeah.
needs to get pulled off these aircraft, and I think this applies to pretty much any high use, large scale aircraft, because aircraft are such complex machines.
Yeah.
They're some of the most complex things we've ever built as human beings.
Right.
Um, and I think keeping those things safe and operational is really critical. And if 5G and AR and VR and all these other future technologies are going to help make that happen faster and cheaper, then I think it's a net positive for everyone.
I agree. And I think there are applications, to rail and that sort of thing. What's interesting, many of our viewers and listeners may not know this, but we've talked about WiMAX in the past, and as WiMAX, hit its apex, and then it was sort of ramping down. One of the last ditch sort of, repositions, pivots for WiMAX was around a very similar use case to allow, pilots to, download, data and that sort of thing. I think it was more of like flight logs and that sort of thing. But certainly there was a tie to maintenance, and the use case and the business outcome was exactly what you just described for 5G. So with 5G, you get a lot of functionality and capability that WiMAX just never possessed. Although WiMAX, that was something that existed many years ago, probably over a decade ago. But yeah, I think it's hugely, this use case is going to be huge, and it's going to improve safety, and it's also going to improve speed. And so when we experience these maintenance issues, a lot of times it's because it's not managed in real time. And so, boy, if 5G can do that for you and I and all the business travel that we do, and reduce maintenance and equipment being taken out, I mean, I would love that. So it'll be cool to see how that kind of how it progresses. But let's move to my third and final topic, and this is also related to the federal government. So your topic was a nice segue. So the U.S. General Services Administration, or the GSA, just this week published its acquisition guidance for procuring 5G technology. This is a 28-page federal agency guideline on how to make use of 5G. Now, what's interesting, our friend Mike Dana, wrote this article up. Mike's, talks about that it doesn't specifically, call out equipment suppliers or mobile network operators, but it does provide a plan and a guideline for what should be considered. No surprise, big plug for Open RAN, but at the same time, the federal government states that federal agencies need to be careful with the respect of how networks are built, and these will be primarily private networks. And we've talked about deployments with the U.S. Marine Corps, and other private 5G deployments. But it does obviously specify, do not use Chinese suppliers like Huawei and ZTE. But I find it interesting that security was pointed out. That's not a surprise, just given what we're experiencing today, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia with nation state cyber attacks. And I've been on the record as stating that I think this is one of the weaknesses of Open RAN. Even though 5G New Radio provides significant encryption improvements over LTE, whenever you disaggregate infrastructure, you're going to increase the threat surface and the likelihood for cyber attacks and that sort of thing. So, and I think there needs to be more attention paid to this. I think this is also a huge opportunity. This week, I'm spending time with Fortinet at their Accelerate event. And yesterday during the keynotes, one of their executives pointed to 5G and security and IoT more broadly as an opportunity for the company. And I agree. I think this is an opportunity for a Fortinet or a Palo Alto Networks that is focused on operational technology environments to bring this to the forefront. But not sure if you caught it, but do you have any thoughts?
In fact, I caught it so well that I almost made it my topic last week.
Okay.
Last minute. This close. I was like, I don't know if I want to bore people with GSA official 28 documents about procurement. But what I took from this, because I actually tried to read the 28-page document, or at least glance over each page and see what.
You're a better man than me. I didn't even go there. I mean, Mike provided the link in his article.
I think that's part of the reason why I chose not to do the topic. But there are some interesting things. I actually think what's more interesting about the topic is, or this statement from the GSA, is where they have this guideline of where they believe 5G technologies are best applied. So there were a series of applications. I'm not going to tell you I remember what they were, but there were government-based applications where it's this is where you should use 5G, or this is a 5G appropriate application. So I think that's really good for educating the government on what what should be 5G and what shouldn't be. And to your point, there was a lot of talk about security, which I thought was really good.
Yeah.
I was looking for the, don't buy Huawei, don't buy ZTE stuff. I didn't see any of that, but
Yeah.
there definitely was a very clear nod to Open RAN,
Right.
which, works in the favor of a lot of US companies. Um, and yeah, I just think this is a good document to have because I think the GSA is kind of seen as the guiding agency for procurement within the US government. So
Most
um,
definitely.
kind of what they say goes.
Yeah.
And if you don't, then you get in trouble. So um, I do think it's a good thing and it will ultimately benefit, I think, a lot of people in terms of both education and helping them to understand what is and isn't okay, in a government application.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, the use cases are quite important. I mean, the hype cycle around 5G is big, right? It continues to be big, especially around private 5G and what it can do. But even in the enterprise in corporate America, there needs to be continual education on, okay, where is it appropriate? Where is it best suited? Is it a replacement for Wi-Fi? And it certainly isn't. I think 5G and Wi-Fi are better together, but certainly, you can think about the military use cases that we've talked about on this podcast. It's just good that this document provides, a highlight of those. So other agencies that are just starting their journey with respect to considering a 5G deployment, they've got a best practice or a lesson learned that they can leverage there. But with that, let's move to your third and final topic, and we're going to provide our viewers and listeners a double shot on T-Mobile. You want to talk about Deutsche Telekom, and I did not catch this news, but apparently they've taken their majority stake in T-Mobile US, and you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so this is from Mike Dano at Really Right Light Reading. Wow, I struggled with that one.
Well,
Um,
yeah, we're shouting out to Mike twice on this podcast, so we got to make sure that we tag him when we post it.
yeah, this was something that I think a lot of people saw coming, because Deutsche Telekom already owned 48% of T-Mobile US, and in fact, T-Mobile US exists because Deutsche Telekom made an investment a long time ago and has
Yeah,
continued to make investments in T-Mobile. They are a publicly traded company, but Deutsche Telekom is able to benefit from its ownership of these shares. And yeah, they recently sold $11 billion worth of their cell tower business last year. So they were obviously looking to park some of that somewhere that they
yeah,
saw would be give them some good returns.
yeah.
And you know, Deutsche Telekom has basically been um, increasing its stake in T-Mobile progressively over the last few years.
Mhm.
Um, in 2021, they increased it from 43 to 48. So they've been ratcheting up their investment, which is interesting because a few years ago, before T-Mobile's resurgence, there was talk about Deutsche Telekom selling
All
T-Mobile.
right. Yeah.
Um, so it's really interesting how things have turned around for T-Mobile. And obviously Deutsche Telekom is benefiting quite a bit from T-Mobile's growth and their share price increase because now, T-Mobile is actually worth as a company $178 billion,
Mhm.
their market cap, which is actually greater than Verizon and AT&T as well as Vodafone.
Yeah.
So they're basically the most valuable carrier in the world right now. And it's just really interesting because Deutsche Telekom, this is one of those situations where I think Deutsche Telekom's share of T-Mobile is probably worth more than Telekom is now.
That's
Um,
crazy.
which
Yeah.
is kind of like the whole Yahoo Alibaba thing where Yahoo made such a big investment in Alibaba that their investment became more valuable than Yahoo itself was.
All right.
Um, so, anyways, I think this is not that big of a news, but it is interesting because technically now Deutsche Telekom does have a controlling stake.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't really think anything will really change. Mostly because Deutsche Telekom seems to understand that T-Mobile US is doing the right thing, and I think they're moving in the right direction. And I will say, it does feel like the Deutsche Telekom T-Mobile closeness has grown. I think we saw a lot of that at MWC.
Yeah.
Because T-Mobile doesn't really have a booth at MWC. They kind of piggyback onto Deutsche Telekom. And it felt like the two companies are working much more closely now than they ever have, especially
Yeah.
with, the TIoT stuff,
Yes.
and a lot of the other, 5G advanced network technology. So I really think that this partnership is getting stronger, and now T-Mobile is technically owned by Deutsche Telekom, even though they were almost already there.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, there are clearly some demonstrable synergies that we've seen. You mentioned the TIoT initiative. So that harmonizes kind of the sell-through for IoT solutions. I think it's also going to benefit T-Mobile US's advanced network solutions by vertical. Deutsche Telekom has considerable lab and test capabilities. We don't hear a lot about that from T-Mobile. They do have their experience center in Bellevue. They have opened a few other proof of concept labs, but not to the extent that, say, Verizon and AT&T have done in the past. So I think all of that is going to come together quite nicely for the companies. And it would behoove Deutsche Telekom to allow T-Mobile to continue what they're doing, not provide direction, because obviously that team, they've been knocking it out of the park for the last several years. Yes, there'll be some transition. Neville Ray will be moving on in the fall, but the company is in quite capable hands, and the momentum is quite strong. And it'll be fun to see how things continue for them. So, but it's been another great podcast this week. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights for a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Will Town Tech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week. And don't forget to rate and subscribe. We'll also be skipping a week next week, so tune in 2 weeks when I'm back from vacation.
And when I'm back from vacation, I'll be in Paris. And I think, Anshel, you're going on your honeymoon finally, right?
And finally.
All right, good. Well, and I'll be on my anniversary. We got married about the same time. So thanks again, listeners and viewers, and we'll talk soon.